I want to start now with what sparked the incident, something that we have heard nothing about to date. Mrs. Shamim Akhtar was travelling back from a holiday in Pakistan. She was feeling unwell on the plane and as a result used the empty seat next to her to be able to sit more comfortably. Shortly after making use of the seat, she could hear a male muttering in the row behind her. At first she paid no attention, but then the male went out of his way over the course of the next several hours to subject her to a tirade of alleged racial abuse. He repeatedly called her a bitch, he used the P word and referred to her as a P-bitch. Mrs. Akhtar for several hours of the flight was scared the male was going to become physical and assault her. Despite her appeals to the Qatar Airlines cabin crew, they did nothing to intervene. She appealed to the male to calm down, but he refused to listen, despite telling him she was unwell. The male began to call her a P-bitch again, and the male stood up behind her. He was towering over her and hurling abuse. It was a mixture of abuse in English and in Arabic. At this point, she became increasingly frightened and intimidated. He was over 6 foot tall and was of large build. The male's wife intervened and told him to stop and asked him to sit down. However, the male continued, and his children were also ridiculing Mrs. Akhtar. Even though she was feeling extremely unwell, she forced herself up and walked to the rear of the plane looking for a seat. She sat down at the back on a random street, however was told to move pretty much straight away as somebody else was assigned to the seat. She had no choice but to come back to a seat and sit down, and the abuse continued for several hours. The male continued to intimidate her by shouting racist abuse and by being a bully. Once the flight landed, Mrs. Akhtar says she walked off the plane and walking towards the baggage claim area, she felt something hit her hand luggage and hitting her behind. She looked back and saw the male standing behind her, and from what she could make out, he was using his hand luggage to repeatedly bump into her. At that point, Mrs. Akhtar began to cry. She was extremely traumatized. She was scared, she was upset and stressed, and she even collected the wrong suitcase, which she did not realize until she eventually got home that evening. As soon as she exited at the arrivals, she saw her 2 sons and a six-year-old grandson, waiting for her. She broke down into tears and told them that what happened to her over the last several hours, and Mrs. Akhtar's sons questioned her, which was Fahir and Ahmad, as to what had happened and who this male was. She told her sons that the cabin crew had failed to assist her. She wanted to leave, but when they walked past Starbucks, she noticed the male in question, and Mrs. Akhtar froze. Both her sons approached the male and questioned him regarding the abuse. The male was rude and proceeded to laugh in her son's face, and an altercation took place. Following this, the family left Starbucks and headed towards the car park. When they got to the car park, Fahir was paying for the parking. I will summarize some of the details because of the ongoing investigation, but police officers, who were 2 females and a male, approached Fahir, and then, without identifying themselves, immediately grabbed Fahir by the wrist. And I have seen, and many of you will have seen, the footage that has been broadcast by the Manchester Evening News, some of it heavily pixelated, but the context that the family wishes to provide is that if you watch closely the footage, that Fahir is immediately grabbed by the wrist, as can be seen on the CCTV. The male officer proceeds to grab Fahir by the neck, and it is alleged that he hits Fahir's head into the ticket machine, at which point the other son, Ahmad, asked the police officer to move his hand from Fahir's neck, as he was not resisting arrest. Ahmad and his mother Shamim were shocked at the unnecessary aggression and violence, alleged violence, shown from the start. There was no immediate attempt to speak to Fahir, to ask him to step aside, to caution him, or to simply say, "Can we speak to you for a second?" The family appreciates you have seen leaked footage with pixelation of the top of vital events as they unfold. However, this is what the context of what took place. When Ahmad asked the police officer to remove his neck hold, it is alleged by him and his mother and others that the male officer then proceeded to punch Ahmad twice in the side of his head, at which point Ahmad falls onto the ground. Mrs. Akhtar also falls to the ground as the officer pulls her and Ahmad down due to the fact that she was holding Ahmad from behind. The officer whilst punching Ahmad, pushes her to the ground, and she looked up and saw the officer firing his taser at Ahmad, at which point she screamed, "They've killed my son," in Urdu. And as you can see from the CCTV, pandemonium breaks loose at that point. At this point, Mrs. Akhtar, seeing Fahir running towards the officer and saw that he is also tasered from behind and lands face first, at which point the officer falls down with him. Mrs. Akhtar then goes to Fahir and can be seen leaning over her son as he lies motionless on the ground. The taser that is used is a prohibited firearm and licensed by police officers to use, and it can emit up to 50,000 volts of electricity. At no point do you see on the video Fahir reaching for any officer's firearms, as is later claimed in the immediate press release from the GMP, nor is he in fact doing anything other than lying motionless face down. It is at this point, as the officer stands up, he proceeds to run and kick Fahir in the face. Mrs. Akhtar then tried to pull her son's head away, and as the officer then attempts to stamp on his head, as can be seen in the graphic video at this point, both brothers are compliant. Fahir is incapacitated. His brother is sat some distance behind on a seat with his hands on his head, with officers keeping him under control. The officer then proceeds to lift his foot up and appears to stamp down on Fahir's head. Mrs. Akhtar states that she attempted to pull her son's head away as she thought the officer could have killed her son at this point. She genuinely believed at this point that her son was dying, as he was limp and unresponsive due to being tasered. The male is alleged, as seen in the video, then kneels down, the male officer, kneels down on Fahir, placing his knee on his back whilst he is still limp, and then looks up straight at Mrs. Akhtar whilst he has his knee on Fahir's back and he is not moving. At this point, it is alleged that the male officer still has his taser drawn, then using his right hand, it is alleged, he strikes Mrs. Akhtar directly in the face using his taser as a weapon. At this point, Mrs. Akhtar never, prior to this or during that point, is presenting any threat to any police officer. At this point, Mrs. Akhtar screams. As she holds her face, she is terrified that she would now be subjected to the same violence as she alleges her son were. This is the bruising that Mrs. Akhtar had on her face. You'll get copies of this at the end of the press conference. But this is the bruising, some of which you can still see on Mrs. Akhtar's face today. She was left bleeding from below her eye. This is what Mrs. Akhtar alleged she was subjected to, and at no point did any officer approach Mrs. Akhtar to check on her well-being or her welfare. At no point did anybody seek to get medical assistance for Mrs. Akhtar, and as she screamed, as I state, she thought that she would now face the same violence as her two sons did. Mrs. Akhtar then held her face, as well as holding onto her son Fahir. She noticed the officer walked off behind her, and she was scared that this officer would attack her from behind. She looked back and noticed that he then pointed his taser at her other son Ahmad, who was sat down with his hands on his head and was complying. Even though she had been attacked, she struggled and stood up. And so the same officer that had allegedly attacked her and her son Fahir then proceeded to kick her son Ahmad and drag him down on the floor and use his taser as a weapon to hit her son on his head. Another officer then sat on top of Ahmad and pinned his head down to the floor and proceeded to threaten him. At this point, Mrs. Akhtar just stood up between her sons who are lying on the floor, and at this point she can hear a 6-year-old grandson crying and her son Ahmad telling her to go to his nephew. Mrs. Akhtar touches her face and noticed she was bleeding from her cheek underneath her left eye. She was stood there and didn't want to leave her sons, as she was genuinely feared for their lives. And she then noticed the officer that kicked Fahir in the head go over and she tells them to stop. At this point, the officer tells her to step back, and then a female officer pushes her away as she is moving away. Another female officer then comes behind her and pushes her back, pushing her back away again. She was left dazed, she was crying, she was disoriented, but noticed the two officers with Ahmad roll him over onto his front, and at this point he was handcuffed from the rear, and now they were kneeling on his chest. The officer then grabbed Ahmad by the neck and pushed his head into the floor before then getting him up and taking him away. She then sees the other officer lift Fahir and also take him away. No officer attended to her injuries. She was bleeding from beneath her eye. No officer approached her to see if she or her 6-year-old grandchild, left with luggage strewn everywhere and clearly distressed child crying for his father, required any assistance. Mrs. Akhtar was ultimately helped by a passerby who saw what happened and taken home. Fahir also heard the scream from his mother, which he believes was when his mother was hit in the eye with the front of the taser gun. At this point, he has no idea where he was or what was going on, or he was picked up, but he was dragged out and placed against a wall outside. Fahir states that he broke down into tears and the verbal abuse continued. Then it is alleged that the male officer came and kneeled down next to Ahmad, and it is alleged he said to him, "You dirty fucking cunt, you think you can hit my officers? I'm going to kill you when I see you in my uniform or out." These are the allegations that Ahmad and members of the family make. Hearing this, Fahir said to the officer, "Why is your body camera not on?" He said, it is alleged, "I will show you why." He grabbed him by the neck and handcuffs, lifted him up. He proceeds to push his head so far down where it reaches his knees and drags him along, making him walk. It is alleged he takes him around the corner where he can't be seen by anyone else or his brother, and throws him face down on the floor and puts all his weight on top of him with a knee over his neck. He then says something along the lines of, it is alleged, "Do you want my camera on now, you dirty cunt?" At this point, fearing for his life, all Fahir claims he is thinking about is that he is going to be killed. He stays quiet and doesn't say a word. There is, of course, much more alleged incidents and verbal abuse that takes place that should be on CCTV or police cameras, if they were, of course, switched on.